Good afternoon and welcome to our discussion, The Intersections of Climate Change and Race. Does addressing climate change mean addressing racism? This event is co-organized by the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University and Climate Refugees, and is co-sponsored by Howard University's Environmental Justice Center and the Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequalities, and Community Health Project. I'd like to thank our panelists joining us today, Philip Alston from York University, Lucky Tran from Columbia University, Ingrid Waldron from Dalhousie University, and Carlton Waterhouse from Howard University. I'd also like to thank our moderator today, Amali Tower, who is the founder and executive director of Climate Refugees. Amali has over 17 years of experience in human rights and protecting the rights of refugees and forcibly displaced populations all around the world. She's resettled refugees, campaigned for refugee and asylum protections, and written and passed U.S. legislation to curb immigration detention. Her personal journey and struggles as an immigrant impacted by conflict and instability herself fuels her work. Years of interviewing refugees fleeing conflict and persecution afforded her the chance to hear the stories of also fleeing climate change. Through this, Climate Refugees was born. I'd like to thank her and all of you for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you, Amali.
Thank you, Christina and Magdalena at Columbia University for that wonderful introduction. Thank you all for being here and to our incredible panelists for generously giving their time and expertise today. To set the stage, you might be wondering why my organization is convening this event. In June, amidst the racial justice protests across the country in the wake of George Floyd's murder, I wrote an op-ed, a narrative human rights fact pattern, if you will, that laid out historic and sustained systemic and structural discrimination on the basis of race that suggested a Black American could have a legitimate basis to seek asylum if outside the country. It was a hypothetical argument, but one that catalyzed thoughts long held that we don't have the luxury of time nor of working separately in silos to address gross inequalities anymore. We have to see the climate crisis as a human rights crisis of injustice as well. And it's why I brought together 4 experts in different but related fields to discuss how exactly we do that. I'd like to optimize our time with these incredible experts and dive right in. So if you'll indulge us, we will share links to our panelists' full bios in the chat as we discuss. And you also, of course, have full information on the event's website. So I'd like to dive right in and first, let's talk about terminology and let's also talk about the disproportionate impacts. I'd like to start with Dr. Ingrid Waldron, who is a sociologist at Dalhousie University, the director of the Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequalities, and Community Health Project, and author and co-producer of the documentary There's Something in the Water. And we're uploading her bio and links to the Enrich project right now. Dr. Waldron, we're increasingly seeing the term environmental racism in media and social media. It's important we understand what this means, especially given our varied audience today. Can you tell us what is environmental racism, and please maybe speak to where exactly you've seen this?
Yes, it's a kind of, people have asked me for quite some time, particularly when I started my project, what is it? Never heard of it. And the simplest definition would be, it's about the disproportionate siting or location of polluting industries and other environmentally dangerous projects in primarily Indigenous communities, Black communities, and other racialized or non-white communities. And it manifests out of policies, specifically environmental policies and environmental assessments. And environmental assessment is a tool that's used to decide where a particular industry goes. So there are several cases of environmental racism in the United States. My book focuses on Canada, but I certainly look at the United States. The term environmental racism was actually coined in the United States in the mid-1980s. So if you think about the Dakota pipeline resistance, you think about Flint, Michigan, 2014, there was a lot of media attention about contaminated water in that, I guess it's a low-income, primarily African-American community, but also low-income white individuals there as well. If you think of Cancer Alley, I think it's near Louisiana, considerable amount of oil or facilities in that community, and the community primarily African American, have high rates of cancer. Where else in the United States? You've got several examples in the United States. In Canada, it impacts primarily Indigenous communities with pipelines running through their communities. There are Black communities here in Nova Scotia that are near landfills that have been there for decades. You've got industry trying to implement brine discharge pipelines in a community here in Nova Scotia called Sabaganagati. So what I'm looking at through my project is specifically pulp and paper mills, pipelines, incinerators, landfills. So that's how it manifests, and they're proximate to these communities. And because they're so close to these communities, many of these communities have significant health problems, particularly high rates of cancer and respiratory illness. And when we do that intersection of race and gender, you'll find that Indigenous women have high levels of reproductive illnesses and reproductive cancers and premature births, etc. So it's also very much of a gendered issue when you think of the health impacts of environmental racism.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And Professor Alston is the John Norton Pomeroy Professor of Law at NYU, where his bio is in the chat right now. He's an expert in international law and human rights and has held several posts with the UN. His most recent post at the UN was Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. And I know, Professor Alston, in that role, and you've certainly seen environmental racism and its global dimensions. And I'm wondering if you can speak to what you've seen in all your travels and research in that role, and how you've seen environmental racism play out, whether it be extraction or exploitive industries. If you could speak a bit to that.
Sure. Thanks, Marley. It's great to be on such a fascinating and challenging panel. It's funny, in reflecting on this, I know we're not onto that yet, but one could make a very good case that the whole phenomenon of climate change is driven by racism, because it's all sort of outsourced. The dominant white elites are going to be able to protect themselves. They don't really care about all the terrible consequences that are being predicted, because that's going to hit them. It's going to hit the others, and that other group is almost always racialized. Certainly, I mean, my experiences around the world really consistently bear out exactly what Ingrid just said. Puerto Rico, I remember vividly being going to visit groups of people living in poverty, and looming over the back were these huge ash mountains. And of course I said, excuse me, what happens when the wind blows? And, of course, just waiting for that to happen, and the kids then start inhaling all of the ash, and it's downhill from there. There's not a single non-poor person to be seen, and the sighting is not incidental. Another example, which will seem very far away, but it was just so extreme that I should tell the story very quickly. In Romania, one of the big issues there is the treatment of the Roma people. And so I went to the second biggest town in Romania, and we were talking about Roma, and I met with the mayor, who was a former prime minister. And I said, so you evicted large numbers of Roma people from the middle of the town, which was a sort of prime real estate, and provided no other accommodation. Yes, we did. We provided other accommodation. Look, here are the photos. And he brought up these photos of lovely housing, big plaster walls and a few facilities here and there. And he said, compare that to the shacks that these people were living in before. They are so much better off. And of course, I knew the background story, but I hadn't actually done the visit at that stage. So after leaving him, I went to visit the people who'd been evicted. And it was more than I could even have imagined. They had literally been shifted from the middle of town to way to the outskirts on top of a toxic waste dump. And that's where these homes were being built. So no water, no legal electricity, no jobs nearby, no transport, and toxic chemicals coming up through the ground. And of course, their children were then suffering all sorts of terrible consequences. But it's really symbolic of what I saw in so many countries around the world.
Wow, fascinating. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, it's really great to hear all your examples, you know, in your work and your research, because I think that really does drive home the point, you know. And Dr. Tran will be sharing your bio as well right now in the chat. Dr. Tran is a biologist and climate science communicator at Columbia University. He was one of the organizers of the March for Science that we all know of, the largest day of science advocacy in history, with over 1 million participants in over 600 cities worldwide. You've been very active in the science justice movement and spoken of the need to fight for communities harmed by bad science policy. I'm wondering what you mean by this, and if you can speak about these communities and what impacts you've seen.
Hi, great to be here. Thanks for that. Yeah, absolutely. So I've always organized around climate and immigration, right? And so as a scientist, my identity, it made sense to organize this group of people who aren't normally seen as activists. And it sort of blew my mind, right? These are the canaries in the coal mine. They're seeing this data which tells us that people are going to be harmed and that, you know, that harm is not equal. It's on, you know, people of color, marginalized communities who are going to suffer the most. They see this, and yet, you know, they're getting the data out there, but that message I felt like for years is just not getting through. Why is that? And, you know, it's great to talk on this panel today on what some of the reasons why that is. So really, but I think there's a misunderstanding, and scientists and people who are advocates of scientists get this wrong all the time. I think there's this thought that if people are educated, they have access to facts, that they will change their minds, and that's not true. You know, it's funny that I'm a scientist and I get on, and the first thing I always say is that facts are not enough. That's not what we're talking about. Values. We're talking about real lives. We're talking about stories. We have to do that a lot better, which is why I started getting organized with scientists. And the other thing that we have to really acknowledge is that in terms of science, science is not always an intrinsic good. It can be used and has been used to do wrong, particularly against oppressed communities and communities of color in the past, right? Numerous examples in the environmental movement that Ingrid, you know, brought up before, and in biology and medicine, Tuskegee, Henrietta Lacks experimentations on, you know, Black communities, Black and brown communities, Indigenous communities, that has all happened in the past. And so we really, in terms of science advocates, need to take a leaf out of other movements for justice and see how that they're connected, and sort of say that we're not just talking about the data, and our role in society is not just to say, here's the data, you politicians do with it what you want, and, you know, I'm sure you do good with it. I think as people who see the data and see the data that says the world is warming, but there's more to that data, right? The world is warming, but this is who it affects. And we see that data. And actually, there's, you know, the UN has a panel called the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Scientists, essentially. You know, the top climate scientists in the world come to review all the literature every year. And they had this thing called the 1.5 degree report. And actually in the report, what it said was that we need unprecedented changes in society to avoid the worst effects of climate change. A very powerful statement, and says a lot more how the field is changing. And so, you know, I think that's where I come at it, is that it's important that we have scientists not in a passive role, saying, here's the data, this is what you do with it, but understand that there's a lot more we could be pushing with, you know, these things that we are seeing. I think it's really important.
Love that. Thank you so much. So I want to turn to Professor Carlton Waterhouse, who is a professor of law at Howard Law, an expert in environmental law, environmental justice, as well as reparations for historic injustice. And he began his legal career at the Environmental Protection Agency. So this is a very interesting perspective you bring. We're uploading your bio right now into the chat. And while I'm speaking of the chat, I do want to mention everyone out there listening, please do, send us your questions, which we'll have time for towards the end of this panel. Okay, so Professor Waterhouse, to lay the groundwork, just as I did with Dr. Waldron, I'd like to ask you if you could briefly explain what is environmental justice? And I just say briefly because I have a follow-up for you as well.
Sure thing, sure thing. Well, first, thanks so much for this opportunity, Amali. It's great to be on this panel with such a distinguished group of persons and experts. I'd just like to build on Dr. Waldron's suggestion, or rather answer, I should say, and suggest that we could enliven that even further to think about environmental justice in three frames, right? So we can think about the distributive justice frame where where environmental disamenities, right, pollution sources are distributed inequitably in the society so that people of color, Indigenous communities, low-income communities have a disproportionate share of these adversities that flow from our economy, right? Exposure to these pollution sources. But we also could think about it on a distributive frame from the standpoint of the goods that come out of the production of these kinds of pollutants, and think about who gets the benefit economically from the consequences of producing these pollutants in terms of opportunities and jobs and management positions and CEO positions and executive positions and stock dividends and returns financially from owning stock in these corporations. There's an inequity that runs along that distributive lens. And then there's also a procedural inequity in that the decision-making process at the governmental level, at the corporate level, and other levels don't adequately include representation of the members of these communities or people of color more broadly, and that their desires and wants are not being largely factored into the decision-making process, particularly for frontline communities. And then lastly, there's a matter of justice as recognition. There really isn't the adequate and equitable recognition of these community members in terms of what they deserve. So I would say environmental justice can run along those three frames in terms of what people's experiences of harm are and how people are removed and excluded from the process. And the consequence is health disparities, right? Like we're seeing with COVID, in terms of people who have a predisposition to the worst susceptibility to COVID-19 as well as death. We can see how prior exposure to fine particulates and other pollutants predisposes you to greater harm. We already know, for example, in the US that African Americans and Latinx communities have disproportionate shares of important criteria pollutants controlled by the Clean Air Act. And we see that this is not just a matter of income, but it actually, we find some cases where higher income African Americans and Latinx community members have a higher exposure than low income whites. And so we see that there's an inequitable distribution of pollution, the harm that comes from it, and the benefits that are derived from it. That to me is the core of environmental justice.
Thank you for that. That's a wonderful, wonderful groundwork that you just laid there. So here's my follow-up question, and I'm going to give you a bit of a lengthy expository question here because I want our audience to understand what we're talking about here. So as I understand it, following years of research, the landmark report, I think it was 1987, called Toxic Waste and Race, was key to crystallizing environmental racism in the US and convening grassroots and Black, Indigenous, people of color into environmental justice orgs, into an alliance that generated the attention of national big, environmental groups. Yet, the big green environmental groups apparently excluded environmental justice leaders from the 2009 cap and trade legislation so as to not detract focus away from cutting emissions. Could you speak to the impacts of this decision and a bill then that didn't include the concerns of the environmental justice community? And just so our audience knows, we're going to share some articles that are very helpful towards demonstrating and documenting what exactly happened. Over to you, Professor.
Thanks so much. So two things I would say about that. One is that this is indicative of my experience when I worked for EPA in the late 1990s in a discussion about the concerns about the concentration of pollution sources and multiple exposures and cumulative effects on communities of color in particular, and that the response from the environmental movement was they didn't want to see a prohibition established on placing new facilities in those communities, as had been proposed by now our departed Congressman John Lewis and then Senator Al Gore in the first environmental justice bill. They did not like that legislation because it meant, in their view, that pollution would spread out of these communities where it's now concentrated, where people of color are also concentrated, into green spaces. So there's a sense in which the environmental movement had a universalist approach that was to protect, right, certain spaces and sacrifice other spaces. I think we're seeing a similar kind of situation around cap and trade. The argument was that we could, in some ways, achieve progress around total greenhouse gas production by engaging in cap and trade. However, the sacrifice is the people who live near those older facilities that would be using trading as a way of getting the allowance to continue to produce more pollutants. And so I think that earlier position marked a real shortcoming in the big greens at the time. Many of them are better now, but I think they didn't get the racism aspect of environmental protection. And I think because they didn't get that, they were willing to continue to use an approach that basically perpetuated racism, perpetuated racist results, perpetuated racist policies and ideologies, neglected the needs of those communities that were facing environmental problems in order to help everyone, right? And this idea of this kind of, race neutral, universal person who gets helped typically means that Indigenous people, African Americans, Latinx communities, Asian Pacific Islanders, and others are actually suffering the consequences, right? To help that, universal person, right? So I think that was harmful because it meant, one, perhaps the bill could have passed if there was greater grassroots support, including by environmental justice activists. Two, I think it was harmful because it furthered the wedge between the big greens and the environmental justice movement. And three, because it was racism. And I think the way that racism was such an insidious part of the big green organizations at the time is reflected in their lack of diversity at the time and reflected in their failure to make real progress. So I think we've seen a great deal of progress that's happened in some of the big greens at this point, where they are acknowledging racism and representing communities of color in particular, trying to fight the good fight against environmental justice. But I think I'd have to say that was part of a very sad time. Not that things are perfect now. There's still a lot of progress that needs to be made, both in DEI and then also just in terms of their commitment to fighting structural racism as an essential ingredient to fighting environmental problems, right? They didn't make the link. And until they get the link that you're not going to deal with environmental problems until you deal with social inequity in the society, which the Brundtland Report established way back, right, when it was initially done calling for sustainable development, they recognized that equity was an essential part of sustainable development. So I think that is something that big greens have to get. And when they get it, then everybody will be better off.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I for one didn't know that, and I'd be surprised if that was well known. And I could not help but think of the incredible missed opportunity, just exactly as you said. So fantastic. Thank you so much for educating all of us about that, because I think going forward, that's the kind of hindsight we need to really understand that this isn't novel. This isn't something new that's happening now that all of a sudden we've awoken to recognizing this as the way forward. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much. So I'd like to switch gears and talk about the dynamics of power and policy. I'd like to turn to you, Dr. Tran. There's a growing anti-science culture in the US, I'd say, but maybe also globally with anti-mask protests that we've seen throughout this year. US environmental protections have been rolled back at record levels. The Paris Agreement, already light on human rights, could be exited next month. So there's a disproportionate racial, poor, marginalized impact that we've already, heard about. As a science communicator, what are your thoughts on how the impacts of the climate crisis generally and with respect to human rights impacts on BIPOC communities can be more effectively communicated? And how do we effectively respond to the inaccuracies based on omission and explicit disinformation?
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's been a really interesting year with COVID. And for me, this is probably another question for another time, but it's interesting how, in terms of both disparities and how the problems we care about and the denial involved maps COVID with climate change, it's really so similar. So I think it's something to really dissect down the track. I think it's definitely important to recognize sort of this anti-science thing is definitely a global phenomenon. So it's important for US people to understand that. And it has a lot to do not with education or anything like that, but with power and who has power and what their intentions are. I think we got to get that right up front. So that's the really important thing. As I said before, I think, one of the reasons I've been organizing scientists is I think we've had a poor approach to this, coming from a fact-based view where and really, to be honest, in our field of science communication, ignoring all the important social studies which tell us that that's not effective. We know number one is that it's interesting, even in this time, Pew Research studies show that scientists are among the most trusted professions. It's more when you talk about political issues which have political dimensions like climate change that people double down on their views. And we know that sometimes actually the biggest climate deniers might have higher academic degrees. It's actually more polarizing at that stage. And so it's not necessarily facts that are going to get us there. It really is storytelling and values and how we get that out there. And that's really important. I think there are three things that I would say that we would need to do a lot better. The first is really talk about those power dynamics and how it affects things. Climate change is one of the greatest moral injustices of our time. The people who are least responsible for it are suffering the most. I think we need to say that all the time. That's the frame that we need to use. And on that, in terms of communication strategies, we need to, when denial is out there, we need to call that out, why that is happening. We don't need to say like, oh, this fact is wrong. I mean, we need to say that, but that's not going to be enough. We're going to see, why did Exxon hide all its climate change data after knowing for years, right? Why were they doing that? They were profiting off it. We need to say that. That happened with tobacco companies and lying about the detriments to health effects, in the 70s and 80s. We need to do that now. So I think that's the number one thing. Another thing is, we need to talk about stories and positive stories too. So that's sort of the combative side of things. But I know in a lot of science communication, when we talk about vaccines and health things, you're not going to combat someone's position by just saying, this is the fact, you're wrong, and end it there. You need to say, what value does this have? And so when we talk about climate change, we need to shift some narratives. Like when we undertake climate action, it's going to make a more just world. We're not going to sacrifice things. We're going to create more jobs. We can create a better society. And so we need to put that message across. But I think the truly most important thing that we need to do is center the voices of the most affected within climate communications. I think we can talk all day about specific messages we're putting out, but until that happens, we're going to be ineffective. And we still aren't good enough about this. So early in this year, and it seems like a decade ago, right? Everyone was paying attention to the Australia fires in my home country, and it was devastating. And I was sitting there watching places that I grew up in burn, and that was really personally really heartbreaking for me. But then I was watching the TV coverage, and we were centering the voices of US white male climate scientists over Indigenous Australians who had warned about this for centuries and managed the land well and, were exploited for centuries. Their voices were not in the media, and we're not telling the right stories there. And in nonprofits and, climate science itself, it's among the widest professions. We need to look at the power structures that are within our organizations itself and do much better there. So we need to work on that. And I think for me, for my community as a refugee, it's interesting. We need to be better at connecting the dots over issues. So I think one of the problems that I see is that sometimes we get definitely climate scientists, but sometimes environmentalists, climate activists sort of saying, the planet is the most important thing. If we don't save that, we have nothing else. And I think that's really poor messaging, right? Because obviously, first of all, everything's connected and it really disregards people's lived experiences. I suffer racism every day. I deal with immigrant justice issues. People deal with patriarchy. There's a whole bunch of different issues we deal with, and they're all connected to those dynamics of power. And so for my community, when I go talk to immigrant justice activists, they never thought they could be welcomed into the climate community. And it's not that they don't care about these problems. We're just not making space and we're not talking about these issues the same way, right? And so for me, I sort of say, and something I realized around the Australia fires too, so I care about climate change and work about climate change because I do care about science and communicating that effectively, and I care about that benefiting people. But really, I think personally, as a refugee, I know what it means to lose a place you love and never have to go back. And that is happening with climate change now. And that's something that refugee communities really get and immigrant communities really get. And actually in Australia, some of the communities who helped recover from the fires the most are refugee communities, Somali communities, new refugee communities. They did the biggest fundraising drives because they understand that sense of loss. And so I think it's so important to make sure we connect to, a diversity of issues and make sure that climate, is part of that and it's not superseding everything and that those voices are raised.
Amen. I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's exactly why I ended up founding this organization, because there just wasn't a refugee perspective in this conversation. And that's true of even refugee perspectives within the 1951 Convention. I'll just quickly say, if you look at what happened in Beirut with the explosion, it's incredible how little attention has been paid to how the Palestinian refugee community they provided so much service, shelter, support, humanitarian assistance to this tiny country that has always afforded protection to so many refugees, So totally agree. Thank you so much, Dr. Tran. Professor Alston, if I may turn to you. We're going to share your last report right now in the chat, in your report on climate change and poverty, that is, as a special rapporteur. You wrote that states avoiding the issue of differentiated responsibilities and treaty bodies not taking a role in determining wealthy countries' responsibilities. You wrote about, this being an issue. Can you explain what you mean by differentiated responsibilities and how do we better address this?
Yeah, this is a term that has been around as Carlton would know far better than me, in the international environmental debates since, at least 1972, the big environmental conference. The idea is a pretty simple one, which is that responsibilities should be attributed based on historical contributions. And so the United States should not be in a position to say, well, hang on a minute, China has 1.4 billion people, we've only got 350, so they should pay 4 times more than we do, etc. Because the other way of looking at it is that the historical contribution to greenhouse gas emissions and thus to climate change has been overwhelmingly in favor of the United States, world champion. And so its responsibilities should be determined accordingly. This is old news in the environmental area. It's been resisted, of course, by the wealthy countries, by the United States, by Australia and others. But in the human rights area, they have tended to sort of just accept that and say, well, look, we're not looking historically here. And again, Carlton's work on reparations and so on, you can't just sort of say, well, we've got a clean slate, let's just begin from nowhere in particular. if you're really looking at the human rights dimensions of it, you've got to start differentiating. And so in calling on countries to do things, it's not just a matter of looking forward with a clean slate. It's a matter of trying to set things right to do justice in the broader context.
Got it. Yep. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's absolutely the truth. Yeah. And Dr. Waldron, your work obviously examines health impacts amid structural racism. I wondered if you could explain how COVID-19 can give us insights into the larger health impacts of environmental racism.
Yeah, I can discuss them independent of the other and then talk about how they converge. So when COVID-19 hit the United States and Canada, eventually we started to realize that it was impacting certain communities, racialized communities, African Americans, at higher rates than other communities. And it was very quick that people were saying that it had a lot to do with poverty and racism, particularly structural racism, in the United States and in Canada. The communities that were disproportionately impacted by COVID were, of course, African Americans and other racialized communities, but people started to talk specifically about why that was. So individuals who are low income, individuals who don't have the privilege of working from home, individuals who are disproportionately located in essential services jobs where they're exposed to the public, individuals who live in dense neighborhoods, and individuals who live in multi-generational families. And we know that racialized communities that are low income often live in multi-generational families because they suffer from intergenerational poverty. And we were seeing the same thing in Canada, not to the same extent and not as quickly, but our public health professional, or many public health professionals in Canada were saying that a particular community, African Nova Scotian community in Nova Scotia, was a hotspot. He declared that in April as a hotspot for COVID. And while the community was upset because they felt that it stigmatized them, they realized very quickly that the factors that were contributing to higher rates of COVID in African American communities were similar in their communities. You know, in the Prestons, in African Nova Scotian communities in general, they're disproportionately low income, disproportionately poor, located in essential services jobs. So what we were seeing with COVID was what we've seen with every other health issue that impacts racialized communities, like higher rates of diabetes, higher rates of cardiovascular disease, for Black men, higher rates of prostate cancer, for Black women, more likely to die from cancer, white women more likely to get cancer, breast cancer, but Black women more likely to die from cancer. So we were seeing the same issue. On the other hand, with environmental racism, once again, when we look at those intersections of race and income and education and living in out of the way places, rural communities for historic African Nova Scotian communities, isolated communities, that intersection makes them more likely to be exposed to the impacts, the health impacts of environmental racism, because those are the communities that tend to be located next to waste sites. But in addition to, I mean, Carlton mentioned this earlier as well, that when we look at how these issues converge, and when we think about comorbidities, which was being discussed a lot when COVID hit, that if you have existing health issues, when you were exposed to COVID, your rates of mortality would be higher because you're dealing with coexisting health issues. So we know then that individuals who are suffering from health inequities due to their proximity to waste sites, so the communities in Nova Scotia and Canada tend to have higher rates of respiratory illness because they live next to polluting industries, high rates of cancer, in many cases rare forms of cancer, and reproductive illnesses, as I described earlier, reproductive cancers. Therefore, those are the communities that are dealing with existing health issues. Put COVID on top of that, it will further compromise their health and their well-being. So it's really important to look at the issues, COVID, environmental racism, and their health impacts independent of the other, but when we bring them together, there's another story. It further compromises the health of these communities. At the base of all of this, Phil, is structural inequities, right? That's what we come to, right? If it's the communities that are disproportionately impacted by waste sites are brown, low income, and Black communities that live in rural or out of the way areas, in the case of Nova Scotia, those are communities that are dealing with other structural inequities with regard to unemployment and underemployment, income insecurity and poverty, food insecurity, housing insecurity. They're dealing with structural forms of racism and other types of racism. Similarly with COVID, it revealed that it's the same structural inequities we're talking about when we talk about any other social institution like labor and education and employment and immigration. It's the same community. So at the heart of this is this notion that structural inequities lie at the heart of everything. And if we don't address structural inequities within all our social systems, not just environment or climate change or health, but within all our social systems, then we cannot really address climate change and environmental racism. That's what it reveals to everyone. So that needs to be addressed. And all these issues actually, as Lucky said, they need to be addressed in tandem, in partnership, together.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, that's a very good segue to talk about systemic exclusion then. And I realize in each of your work, it's clear how much systemic exclusion remains a problem. And Professor Waterhouse, you've written, and I'm quoting, despite the lip service given to sustainable development, free market idolatry accompanies class dominance as a driving force in American society and economic policy. Care to elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which the morality of our social system is put on hold in order to promote a certain kind of neo-capitalist model or neoliberal economic model of capitalism, right? And so rather than recognizing that the society is an institution or is a structure that enables people to live together to promote justice, equality, and freedom, like the social contractarians believed, there's a sense in which the purpose of the society is to promote market benefit and to promote economic growth. And that kind of model decides to treat people as an instrument rather than the end, right? And so human flourishing has to be the end that we're all seeking. And if we're all seeking human flourishing, then we have to say capitalism is to serve us. We're not here to serve capitalism. So to the degree that our economic approach furthers human suffering and misery, then we need to move away from that economic approach. And I'm saying idolatry would be a commitment to an economic approach that isn't benefiting the majority of the population, right? And that's the only way I can view it. And unfortunately, sustainable development in the eyes of many people has been merely a way of saying, let's keep doing our economic kind of capitalist profit seeking at the expense of people, but let's do it in a way that's more ecologically friendly, right? So there's this sense that we will actually be ecologically thoughtful, but we're going to disregard the equity of the human beings. So we will be conscious of our impact on plant life and animal life and try to do our market work in a way that is in harmony or more in harmony with those systems, while disregarding the well-being of our fellow human beings and the misery that they're suffering and the death and harm that they're experiencing. And this is where I think the United States kind of sustainability movement has faltered, in that it is not sustainable in a social sense yet. They're working on being sustainable in an ecological sense, but it's not sustainable yet in a social sense. And I think sustainable development requires equity, obviously in the international sphere, as Dr. Alston would note. Obviously, social development goals emphasize equity. Equity is a part of the conversation, but in the US, it's all about markets and maybe doing some, ecologically friendly approaches to your profit.
Absolutely. Well, that's maybe a good time to ask you then, Professor Alston. You've written in many different ways, that the global system is completely off track to meet the goal of eradicating extreme poverty by 2030. And in fact, poverty will increase with the climate crisis. Could you speak about the connections then between climate change and economic policies, including those directed at development and poverty reduction?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just doing what Carlton had foreshadowed, in the sense of taking to the international level his analysis. In the report that I wrote a couple of months ago, I look at the so-called Sustainable Development Goals, which tend to dominate development discussions these days, and which are assumed to be entirely compatible with our goal of eliminating global poverty and, of course, of reining in climate change. But the reality is that these goals are premised on very unrealistic rates of growth, which are assumed to continue through 2030. And it's on that basis that we'll be able to level everyone up. So there's two problems. One is that COVID-19 and climate change are going to hugely disrupt that scenario regardless, because you won't be getting those rates of growth under any circumstances. And the almost bigger problem is that if you were to get those rates of growth, given the growth model that remains absolutely dominant, it would be totally counterproductive in climate change terms. And so we haven't tried to reimagine what we envision to be growth and sustainable. And I think that's a real challenge. And the problem from a UN perspective is that whenever I hear the Secretary General or any other senior official, they will put out very eloquent reports about the terrible situation in relation to climate change or gender inequality or poverty. And they will always say the Sustainable Development Goals are thus the answer, and we must get back to those. And the problem is that until we start recalibrating, reimagining, if you like, what the sustainable development process really should consist of, we're not going to be making the progress that they assume will and should happen.
Thank you for that. Dr. Waldron, you just tagging on to what Professor Alston just said, you've written about racial capitalism and environmental racism's profit motive. Is that kind of, I mean, is that one of the missing elements that Professor Alston was just kind of talking about?
Yeah, I mean, there have been increased, conversations happening more frequently about racial capitalism, because typically we have conversations about capitalism independent of racism. And people are recognizing, or they probably always have, that racism and capitalism need each other for their successful operation, right? So environmental racism, for example, is a perfect example of racial capitalism, because environmental racism relies on the expendability, for example, of Indigenous and Black people, the dispossession of their land, and the exploitation of their resources, right? It depends on that for its successful operation. Industry owners rely on those resources in order to make profit. So there's a reliance on differentiation of race, on racial hierarchies, on racial differences. So we have to see capitalism and racism as issues that go hand in hand, which typically hasn't been the conversation. There's been a conversation of capitalism being the endpoint, right? And there's equity, and capitalism has nothing to do with racism. But we know when we think about slavery, and we think of the exploitation of Black bodies for profit, and the ongoing exploitation of difference, of people who are different with respect to economic inequalities and social inequalities and structural racism, that racial capitalism relies on racism and the ongoing differentiation of people based on skin color. So these are conversations that are being had. I think about, there's a term called environmental blackmail, and I think about an African Nova Scotian community called Lincolnville, where industry owners were planning to put the landfill in that community. That was back in 1974, and that community was promised jobs. The jobs never panned out, but it's very easy to blackmail low-income, racialized communities because these are communities that are poor, and you promise them jobs, and then they have to make a decision. I get to have a job, but I also get to have my health impacted and compromised, right? But so that's a decision they have to make, but that's a decision that poor communities have to make because they're underemployed or they're unemployed. So they know that that potentially compromises their health and well-being, but there's a job being offered. That's a really good example of racial capitalism, because industry owners are selecting or targeting low-income communities because they know that that's a decision, that's a difficult decision, but they know that these communities will choose the job because they're so underemployed. So that's our kind of reliance on differentiated bodies based on race, but on the fact that these are communities that are suffering poverty and low income, and that you can exploit those communities based on their racialized identities for profit. So environmental racism provides a really great example of that, but I think when we continue to have conversations on capitalism, we have to understand that race and racism must be central to those discussions. You cannot talk about capitalism without talking about racism, because the people who are most harmed by capitalism happen to be Indigenous peoples, people of color, brown individuals, etc.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. So I want to get to solutions, which I think is, the most important part of this. So very, very quickly, if I may, Dr. Tran, ask you, obviously this is close to my heart. I'd like to talk to you about forced migration due to climate change, which I think is certainly a part of talking about systemic exclusion. And of course, one of the impacts of climate change is displacement and forced migration, either internally or across borders. And with the across borders part, there's a lot of discussion about, framing this and the responses, usually certain racist and xenophobic responses in an environment that's already hostile to refugees. So as a climate and immigrant justice activist and a refugee yourself, your thoughts on a counter message that's also useful to engage with policymakers?
Yeah, I think it's so important. I think, first of all, we have to, I guess, acknowledge the connections between climate and immigration. I don't think it's always acknowledged when and where it should be, right? For instance, everything that's happening in the border, forced separation, people being locked up in cages, there's a climate connection to that that's not always in the news, right? Because a lot of people are coming from places which are suffering from droughts and floods, etc. And then heck, when we talk about gun violence, some of the shootings that happened in New Zealand and El Paso, the people who perpetuated that had a, I guess, eco-fascist frame, right? They were blaming immigrants or Indigenous people or Black people on, the woes of the environment, and that was their motivation. So first of all, before we talk about solutions, I think we got to acknowledge, those connections again. That's really important. Messages around immigration are very difficult, as you know, and it's even more difficult when you compound them across, I guess, the polarity of climate. So I think one of the most important messages that we need to put out there, and I think it's happening, but it has been a problem for many years, is this idea of individual blame, because there are racist connotations to that. Overpopulation has been a big thing for years and years and years, and that undoubtedly has a racist connotation to that, right? It's usually blaming, people, Black, Indigenous people of the global South And that's a huge problem. And I think we need, again, to look at power and say, like, it's systemic change that we need to look at, the systemic forces that are causing climate change, and fight against those. And when we do that, it's actually beneficial to everyone, right? It's the story that we need to do. We need to build a more equitable, just world, and that's going to benefit everyone. And so I think that positive framing is really important. The thing about jobs is really important too. It strikes me as really important that both in the spaces that I've worked around, there's myths around jobs, right? With climate, there's a myth that we're going to have to sacrifice to get climate action done, but that's not true. You know, the Green New Deal is a policy framework around building better jobs and, you know, making us better in the long term. And also with immigrants, there's always this framing that immigrants are here to take your jobs and we're going to get an influx of immigrants who are taking away your jobs, whereas immigrants really are job creators. That they help us all, you know, and I think that frame is very important. So there are many positive messages of being in this together, and you know, immigrant justice is a way of helping us all. And you know, and obviously the overwhelming frame that it's one of the most important moral issues of our time, right? Because of that inequity and how it's perpetuated. I think that needs to be a strong driving force as well. But yeah, I think it's something that we need to work on a lot more. And I guess coming back to, I guess, my original point is that we're not going to get all of that framing until we put voices of color in climate conversations, in policy arenas, etc. We don't see that. It's the people who are most affected that need to have those voices in those decision-making halls. That's not happening at the moment. And I think that's really the most important thing we need to do.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Okay, let's talk about solutions. And especially how each of us can contribute towards all of these things that we've been talking about. Professor Waterhouse, the Environmental Justice for All Act, which we're going to share right now in the chat, I'm wondering what your thoughts are. As I understand it, it could even allow, if it passes, of course, it could even allow legal recourse for disproportionate pollution under the Civil Rights Act. Are these the types of tools we need, and how can we help ensure it's passing? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you. I think it really does. It does some important things. One, the Supreme Court rolled back civil rights law, I guess would be one way to put it, the ability for individuals to bring a suit under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which was passed in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that prohibits those who receive grants from the federal government from discriminating in the way they carry out their programs and policies, right? And so that had been a powerful tool to prohibit discrimination in municipal services, in the provision of hospital services, transportation services. But the Supreme Court basically said the only way you can now use this to challenge, for example, people who are using government funds in a way that has a disparity would be to prove that they did it with some racial animus in mind. In the past, because the agencies all passed regulations to say that not only is it prohibited to use our money in a way that you intentionally discriminate, they say it's prohibited to use our money with criteria and methods that have the effect of discriminating. Right? That's what their regulations say. So that's the law. It used to be that individuals could bring a suit to enforce those laws, but the Supreme Court rolled that back in a case called Alexander v. Sandoval and said Congress could have only intended to prohibit intentional discrimination, right? So they're reading back this idea of a narrow vision of civil rights protections, which has been what the court has been doing over the last 10 to 15 years. And so with that, they've shrunk our abilities to bring suits against people who discriminate. Now this act would empower individuals under Title VI to then bring those suits again, bring evidence of disparity in the way the Department of Environmental Protection in Pennsylvania or New Jersey or in Georgia or Alabama or Mississippi or California or Nevada, the way that they are actually providing permits can create disparities in pollution exposure. You cannot challenge those individually. You can only now go to the federal government, the EPA, and bring a suit under Title VI to say, hey, we're not a suit, but a complaint, to say, I want to complain about discrimination I think that's happening in my state. EPA then is then charged to investigate your complaint. Unfortunately, EPA has not done a very good job of bringing these investigations to book. In fact, they've only had one finding of disparity and discrimination in one of their grant recipients in the whole lifetime of the program. And actually, I filed that report with EPA in 1999 before I left the agency, and they didn't issue it until 2017 against the state of Michigan for discrimination that had occurred way back in the mid 1990s, early 1990s, I should say. So EPA has not done a good job. This act restores the ability of individuals to then bring suits on their own behalf. And so that will help with solutions. And they have other good solutions involved as well. The New Jersey legislation is also important environmental justice legislation for people to look to, because it would prohibit actually granting new permits to increase pollution in communities that already are facing disparities based on an overburdening of pollution for people of color. So I think that these two bills do a lot of important work that can help us fight against environmental injustice.
And we should, would you say then that we should be, each of us calling our representatives and our senators and asking them to support it?
Absolutely. We should be advocating for the passage of this bill. It also codifies Executive Order 12898, which is something that guides the federal government in making sure that they identify and address disproportionately high and adverse human health and environmental effects on low-income and minority populations. It also requires that there's a cumulative impact analysis when we're looking at the way pollution is being regulated under the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. So there's a lot of important things in it. We need to advocate for the passage of this bill with your senator, with your congressperson, in order to see that we can see this move forward. It does vital work. It doesn't solve the environmental justice problem, but it gives people on the ground more tools to work with to try to improve these problems.
Great, thank you so much. I'm mindful of the fact that we have nearly an entire page of questions because there are over 400 people that have tuned in today. So I have a question that I wanted to ask all of you, which is, what activities are you involved in your respective work areas vis-a-vis the climate crisis? And can you share outcomes in which, can you share outcomes and ways in which we can help? So maybe I could have you all sort of speak briefly to that, while I also, or you could, fold that into maybe some direct questions that so many people out there have. Would that be all right with you all? Yeah, should we address it like that? Okay, great. So let me pose something a bit more general that'll help you guide that. Okay, here we go. I'm a bit overwhelmed with how many questions there are. Okay. While the inequities along racial and ethnic lines are bad in the US, they dwarf the inequitable manner in which the United States treats the rest of the world, particularly African nations and peoples who have contributed the least to climate change. How can Americans encourage their government to end its discrimination of other countries? Does international law have a role to play? I picked that because I feel like all of you are working in ways in which I think that addresses multiple points of that question. If I guessed that correctly, hopefully I can maybe Professor Alston, if I can have you start, since there's an international legal component there as well. And we'd really love to hear what work you're doing on working on right now, and ways in which we can help as well. And I can repeat the question if necessary.
No, I get it. I think the background was the president's reference to a certain category of countries, and I can't repeat the adjective on the webinar, but that sort of encapsulated the whole racist attitude towards a great many countries. And one example of that, I should have mentioned this before, I did a report several years ago about the UN's failure to acknowledge its responsibility for taking cholera to Haiti. And even to this day, it doesn't acknowledge that it had any responsibility, although there's just no question of the scientific and other aspects of that link. But an awful lot of that is down to racism, because these people are just Haitians. They're not particularly deserving. We don't need to treat them in the same way that we would if this was a white community, where we'd be absolutely outraged at what had happened, and there'd be demands and there'd be a response. And sad to say, one of, if not the key country pushing this refusal to acknowledge responsibility is the United States, which has played an absolutely central role. More broadly, some of the work that I've been doing is to argue that human rights and environmental groups need to be working more closely together. Traditionally, there was a very big split. The notion is that I work on human rights and I can therefore trace individual responsibility. So Tran tortured me and violated my rights, and I can take action against him. But climate change, well, that can't be a human rights issue because Tran didn't do anything. Not even the United States did all of what happened to me. And so there's no one to put the blame on. And that has led to this real bifurcation where the two groups were just doing their own thing and assuming they didn't have much overlap. But this panel has been a terrific antidote in part to that, because if you can come in and say, listen, frankly, I don't care about environmental issues. They're too complex for me. I'm just a human rights person. I work on racism and gender. And of course, you've immediately got to say, oh, well, great. So don't you realize that if you have any concern about those sets of issues, they are integrally linked to the environment. And I'm afraid, my friend, you cannot simply say, I don't do environment, it's too complex, it's not of interest, because it's there in the background. It's having these pernicious effects and it's got to be addressed. And then, of course, there's the much broader issue, which is also gaining recognition through litigation in many countries around the world, arguing that it is a matter of human rights obligations that governments take their environmental responsibilities seriously. I was involved in a sort of distant way in recent Irish litigation, and the center that I work in at NYU has a very big project run by Cesar Rodriguez Garabito on climate change litigation, which is really trying to bring the two worlds of human rights and climate change together. And obviously, environmental racism is a very important part of that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I was on mute. Dr. Tran, any thoughts and also about your work?
Yeah, absolutely. No, you're right in terms of thinking about it on a global scale. I guess actually to connect the two, so the work that I work around, right, is connecting, movements for justice and, scientists and science a lot. And actually the thing that's happening is, why is science censored by certain governments? And it really comes to who is harmed and do we care about who is harmed, right? It's Black, Indigenous, people of color communities that are harmed, whether it's COVID or climate. And that's happening in the US and it's happening all around the world. So we are, with my work with the March for Science and other movements for science advocacy, we are working on that a lot. So obviously, so first of all, there's a big thing that's happening right now in the United States that affects the entire globe, right? So number one way people can help all of our work is to get out there and vote. This election is so important, and one of the obviously direct effects is that, the Paris Climate Agreement in terms of international diplomacy, we can still save that, but if the election goes the wrong way, we're out of that, and that's going to have huge repercussions. That's not everything. It's nowhere near enough to solve all of this harm and injustice that's happening, but it's a step, and we'll be put back years if we don't have that step. So that's important, you know. And obviously everything that's happened with censorship at the EPA and other bodies, that's really important that we go out there and vote. The other thing is we need you, everyone, to become a climate activist. And there are many ways to do that. I would, you know, look up groups in your local community, particularly local groups which work on environmental justice issues and are led by frontline communities. I would follow their lead. I think that's really important. And you know, on the global scale, something that would have happened this year is every 5 years or so, there's a big climate change meeting called Conference of Parties. That's been put off because of COVID. So we have another year to prepare about it. And it's where big climate policy and negotiations happen on the global scale. So something that's happening in the next year that's really important is to make sure that framework of justice and frontline communities are heard when we get to that meeting, right? And so a lot of groups are working on this in various ways. The way we're working on this is actually that report that I mentioned, the 1.5 degree report put together by, you know, hundreds of climate scientists that said we need unprecedented changes in society. That's one of the best records or summaries of the science we have, and it's not actually accepted at that meeting, the meeting on climate change to decide everything. And the reason why is countries like the US and producing countries, they're blocking that report. And so, and we're working with frontline communities, particularly in the Pacific Island nations, in Asia, in Africa. Those groups are putting forth the science, you know, they understand what it means to them because their skin really is in the game. It's countries like powerful countries like the US, which are blocking that. And so one way to help that work is to become a climate activist and push, you know, if you're in the United States, push the government to acknowledge that report and acknowledge other things to be incorporated to have a rights-based approach to these climate negotiations in 1 year's time.
Sorry about that. Professor Waterhouse, would you care to comment and also tell us about your work and how we can help?
Yes, so one of the things I'll just mention is that as some of the people have put into the Q&A, that I think we have to see that there's a historic fight in some ways against global white supremacy that is at play here. And if you look at the work of Charles Mill in The Racial Contract, he kind of explains how colonialization from Europe to much of the global South kind of represented the development of a contract between the white European nations that they would basically subjugate the other nations for their own individual benefit and their economic exploitation. And so that kind of history really leads along the Industrial Revolution to these kind of climate crises that we experience today, right? Because the consequence of that exploitation of the global South in order to produce wealth and luxury and prestige in the global North has these long-term consequences and effects. So I think there has to be advocacy for acknowledgement of this historical legacy of racism and climate inequality, and to see reparations or environmental restitution as part of our solutions, right? And to kind of look at how reparations in the individual context of different countries is an appropriate response to this kind of historic legacy of inequality and subjugation. But then also there needs to be some restitution for the environmental harms that have been perpetrated against some communities by these nations that has these long-term consequences, health consequences, right? And so what we do in the Environmental Justice Center is to bring students together, phenomenal students at Howard University who are working on projects to promote advocacy for communities and new policy approaches. So right now we've got two interesting projects, one in which our students are looking at sustainable resilience action planning in American cities to see how well environmental justice has been integrated into that those decision-making processes. And then also to look at existing proposed climate legislation to see how well it accounts for environmental justice, right? Looking at federal legislation and state counter proposals as well. And so our work is to kind of bring this lens of environmental justice to bear on the climate change kind of conversation and policy development more broadly. And I think in terms of partnering, we are looking for partners, organizations that are grassroots organizations, organizations that are scientists and others who want to see environmental justice furthered. Reach out to us so we can collaborate and partner in these efforts. We have to work together. Lastly, I'll say, if you are in a community that's not suffering from environmental justice and you want to see climate change advance, then you need to ally with communities that are suffering from environmental justice, right? You need to make yourself a partner to assist them in their local fights, because their local fight is part of the larger global fight. And they need you to aid them, provide them with the support as an ally would, to help them to be successful. And that will help all of us to be successful in this larger global fight against climate change.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Dr. Waldron, I want to fold in, talking about your work and how we can help with another great question from one of our participants listening. So this question actually is directed to you. You discussed the concept of blackmailing poor and minority communities for approval of projects which will be detrimental to community inhabitants, promising jobs to desperate people, etc. Even in the Canadian context, where the government is to some extent willing to negotiate directly with communities, outcomes often leave historically oppressed people behind. What would you recommend in terms of solutions? And I think this is great because you can tell us what you've been working on for, well, decades really, right?
I think when you look at both the Indigenous communities and Black communities, they would both say that the government does not consult with them, that projects are implemented in their communities and they find out about it in the middle of the project or at the end. So over the past, since 2015, I've been trying to make environmental racism legislation a reality. I collaborated with a politician, Lenore Zan, who's originally from Australia, in 2015 to develop a private members bill on environmental racism, which was the first environmental racism private members bill in Canada. We introduced it April 29th, 2015, and it was debated and it went to second reading in November of that year. And it was an opposition bill. You know, the bill didn't come from the political party that is in power. So it never moved to legislation. So this year, just before COVID hit, Lenore contacted me and she said, why don't we refashion or modify that 2015 bill and make it a federal bill? Because the 2015 bill was a provincial bill, a Nova Scotia bill. She said, what do you think about us making this into a federal bill? I said, of course, I think this is great. We can address pipeline issues across Canada. So she introduced it in the House of Commons in Ottawa in front of our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, February 26th of this year, and plans were on the way to kind of put that forward to second reading, and then COVID hit. Of course, we didn't know COVID was really coming. We were looking at the television, U.S. television, but we didn't know when it was coming to Canada. So our plans are on hold, or we had to put our plans on hold. And I said to Lenore, I said, what next? You know, because COVID is here, and when do you think we can put that forward to second reading? She said, perhaps in the fall. And fall is here, of course. So 2 weeks ago, I emailed her and I said, what's happening with the bill? And she said, you know what, Ingrid, I'm going to be putting it forward on December 2nd of this year. So if this becomes a reality, this would be huge in Canada. It would mean that government would have to consult with communities. There are particular stipulations in that bill in terms of reparations, in terms of financial compensations to communities like Lincolnville that lost out. When they put that landfill in their community, the bill talks about health impacts, and the bill basically talks about, you know, the need for government to be transparent around decision making. So what we need in Canada is for the public, members of the public, to support this bill. I have engaged some partners of mine, and we are planning a campaign right now, petition signings, letter writing campaigns. We want a strategy, a very robust strategy to engage the public to support this bill. So that's something that I really think is important. I think it's a piece of the puzzle in Canada to kind of center the voices of racialized communities. I'm also working with my hero from the United States, Dr. Robert Bullard, who, as you probably know, is the father of environmental justice. I invited him to a symposium in 2017 here in Halifax, and I was invited to be part of his National Black Environmental Justice Initiative with Santiago. There's somebody called Santiago who's also an environmental activist. So I just said to him, I said, I'm Canadian. Is there a place for me here? I don't know, where I fit, because I know they're working with Joe Biden on various things. So I don't know where that's going to take me, because of course they're focused on the United States, but I'm very excited to be part of a group with my hero. And the other thing that we need in Canada, which a lot of countries have, is the legal right to a healthy environment. A lot of countries around the world have that, but for whatever reason, we have yet to secure the legal right to a healthy environment in Canada. So Philip talked about human rights. People who are in human rights need to connect with environmental justice issues. What we want to do with this network is not just recruit people who are in the environmental sector or climate change sector. We want to get people who are also involved in health. We have somebody on board who's in breast cancer. That's her particular area. People involved in human rights, people involved in issues outside of the environmental realm, because we want to show the government in Canada that a lot of different people in diverse sectors are interested in this issue and engaged in this issue. So those are some of the things that I'm interested in right now, and that I'm trying to engage the public in across Canada.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, that sounds great. Also great to hear about Joe Biden working with, as you say, the father of environmental justice. That's really encouraging.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. Professor Alston, I had wanted to ask you, but pass up the question for time, but we have a question that is very similar to mine as well. I'd wanted to ask you whether you think there might be a blind spot to maybe like Western privilege or even white privilege, if I may say so, in global policy. And there's a question here that says, looking at the global crisis of Black people that is due to police brutality in America and Nigeria, the mass incarceration of Black American men, environmental problems pervading our communities, lack of generational wealth and poverty, when the exploitation of African regions such as, and then the exploitation of African regions such as the Congo. These issues are connected and stem from concentrated economic power in the United States and Europe. So what do you think are the economic steps that need to be taken by Black people as a collective? And if anyone else would like to comment as well, you're more than welcome.
I don't know whether the beneficiary of white privilege is the best person to answer this question.
A global system, that's perfectly fine. And then we can, that's a very, very fair comment. So we can then open up the rest to anyone else on the panel.
Yeah, I mean, I am very well placed and very poorly placed to give an answer to it. I don't know. I've worked for decades now on issues like police killings in a whole range of countries. I've done on the spot reporting, and I'm well aware of the links to economic interests. I guess it's important, of course, to say that they're not only white. So, in Kenya, in Nigeria, they are fully black controlled groups that are profiting, but so much of it is indeed done in order to suppress poorer people and to promote the economic interests of the elites. And since the white elite dominate global economic relations, that is the dynamic that is reproduced globally. And I think it's fair to say that the United States, and even more so my own country, Australia, stands very much for that proposition that we will do everything to improve the economic well-being of the dominant white populations, and that very often involves exploitative and oppressive measures towards non-white countries and groups. But what can be done about that? I mean, I think we all have our own roles in a sense. We have to, some of us work from within, some of us have to work from without. It's absolutely essential that there should be a comprehensive spectrum. And I've always taken the view in my own work that someone needs to be out in left field. And often enough, I've been happy to be the one out in left field, while at the same time recognizing that others need to be working within the system, working with the Biden team and hopefully incoming administration to change things. But that doesn't take the pressure away from what Lucky described and Carlton described about, you know, get out there and work with your local groups, because that's really where the action is all going to come from.
Absolutely. Well, we're nearly out of time. So if someone has a pressing comment, you know, in maybe a minute, please feel free. I'm sorry, that's a huge, huge question. But
let me just add on, I think, those excellent comments by Dr. Alston, and that would be to say that really beyond the white kind of supremacy conversation within each country, we still have these other conversations about social injustice that turns on tribe, gender, class, ethnicity, and religion, right? And these conversations are just as important. This kind of group-based dominance exists in a kind of a white supremacist context, but it also exists within these micro contexts of societies. And social dominance theory kind of helps us see how groups dominate over other groups. We need people to take up, wherever you are, right, those questions, because they're not part of the sustainable development conversation enough right now. And we need environmental activists to fight against group-based dominance wherever they find themselves, as part of really recognizing what real sustainability will mean. And so wherever you are, whether it's religion, class, geography, ethnicity, whether it's your indigeneity, we need group-based dominance to come out of the equation if we want to bring environmental quality and justice into the equation.
wonderful. I think that is an excellent place to leave it. I just cannot thank you all enough. It's an incredible honor to have listened to you, all four of you, for the last hour and a half. And I just wanted to thank the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University for co-hosting this event with climate refugees, and especially to Christina Eberbach, Magdalena Medley, and who are such great activists and a true pleasure to work with. Thank you also to our co-sponsors, the Enrich Project and Professor Carlton Waterhouse's project at Howard Law, and Outside PR as well, for sharing this event with their networks in the environmental community. Thank you all for the great work that you do. I think we have a lot of resources here for everybody listening where you can get involved in numerous ways, at the local level, at the global level, and everything in between. So please follow all these wonderful people's work. Feel free to reach out to me if there's anything I can ever do to facilitate. And thank you for tuning in. And we wish you all so much gratitude. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
It's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great to be on the panel with you. Great panelists. Fabulous.
Likewise, absolutely. I'll reach out to each of you if you don't mind to talk about partnering.